this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In 1939, incredibly, the British Army still fielded cavalry units that had yet to be mechanised, relying on horses as they prepared for war. When conflict broke out, these regiments, many of them Territorial Army Yeomanry units, were mobilised, with horses being requisitioned to meet the demand. By 1940, the 1st British Cavalry Division was deployed to the Middle East, where it would play a significant role in Operation Exporter, the Allied invasion of Vichy-controlled Syria. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Washington, author of Fighting Vichy from Horseback, British Mounted Cavalry Action in Syria 1941, to explore this fascinating chapter of military history. Jonathan, thanks for joining me. As ever, when we talk about the Second World War, the First World War usually gets overlooked. Now, coming out of the First World War, one might view cavalry as being obsolete. So why do these units still have horses in 1939?
Well, the short answer, they do actually still need them. That's a short answer. Now, why do they still need them? If you look back at World War One, the reason most people assume cavalry weren't around in World War Two is because they assume that World War One proved horses weren't needed. And that is an incorrect assumption. World War One very firmly solidified the fact that horses were still needed in combat. The fact they weren't always used well, that's the same as the charge of the Light Brigade. That also showed that horses could be used badly. So if you take some kind of operating assumptions in World War One, like Haig, for example, saw cavalry as an operational asset, that was incorrect. They were very good as a tactical asset, precisely because they moved quickly. And the way the order system worked in World War One was that if a battalion commander sees an opportunity to exploit, if he hasn't got cavalry under his command, he can't seize it quickly. The point about being an operational asset is that the cavalry are under the command of the operation commander. And by the time that has gone all the way back up the chain and gone back down the chain, that gap is missed. So but at times they were used tactically as a tactical asset, such as in 1918 at Amiens, and very effective. They were perfectly effective against infantry with machine guns, so long as the infantry weren't dug in. But again, that's the whole point of cavalry. You don't use them by themselves. You disrupt the enemy. The enemy are on the move, and there's a bit you put in cavalry. And because the cavalry, remember, carry the same weapons as the infantry, they carry machine guns and rifles and all that kind of stuff. So they move very, very quickly, they dismount, and they shoot they can charge them as well. They're trying to do it very quickly, and they did that effectively as well. And there's a classic example of a cavalry action in World War One in Palestine, where there's a cavalry regiment, which, remember, has got an armoured car squadron as well. It's armoured car troop. This is the 2nd Lancers, and they see some Turkish soldiers. This is at Musmus Pass. They realise they're strung out, and they caught them on the hop. The regimental commander doesn't even do anything because the doctrine is so ingrained, they understand it so well. And because they're cavalry, they assume they have to act on their own initiative, because that's how it works, the nature of the beast. The lead squadron commander charges, while the next squadron commander along dismounts and puts down supporting fire. The armoured car troop starts putting down supporting fire, and all of this really before the battalion commanders really had time to do much. And this happens very, very quickly. That's a good example of it. And what's significant there, you've got armoured cars, you've got machine guns, riflemen, and fast charging lancers all happening in the same breath, and it was very effective. I think another kind of milestone which reflects that horses actually weren't going anywhere is that by the time the British had refined their use of tanks, so in 1918, remember that tanks aren't designed to replace cavalry. And that's a mistake I think most people make. Tanks are essentially mobile machine gun posts. They're not designed to move quickly. Nobody's designed them with the intention, oh, this will replace cavalry. This being World War One, the communication is pretty difficult. Radios don't work terribly well. Communication between tanks is very difficult when they're under fire. And so in 1918, when they've really nailed how to use tanks, they put company tank commanders on horseback, because that's the best way of getting tank to tank. and briefing each individual tank. Right there, you've got it's like a bit of a time capsule almost in operational procedure.
Yes.
Operational doctrine, yeah.
Sending out your runners between tanks, almost.
Oh, essentially, that's precisely what the company commander's doing there. That doesn't show you why cavalry still around 1939, but it does show you that the succession from cavalry to tanks isn't a thing, even if it was, it'd be very, very messy. 1920, the British doing what is effectively this post-match analysis, and at the same time is very determined about turning itself from the biggest and best the British Army's ever been back into a colonial police force, just stripping everything down. In terms of being ready for a future war against modern power, obviously they accept that tanks and armoured cars and all that kind of stuff are a good thing. They therefore also, on that basis, assume that they will be eventually phasing out horses, but it won't happen yet. And essentially, that's precisely the tension that exists all the way through until March 1942.
When they eventually phase them out.
Effectively. Yeah, we've got horses, we'll sort it out later.
At which point, that's like a 20-year period. Do the tactics of the cavalry stand still insofar as, well, we're going to phase them out, there's no point in developing them any further? Considering new tanks are coming on, by the 30s, they're much better than the Matildas. They're more mobile, bigger platforms with guns on. The
short answer is yes, but all the tactical innovation happens during a 6-week period when they're fighting in Syria, when they're actually in combat. So there's a substantial tactical innovation as a result of the Syria campaign, specifically for using cavalry even better in the mountains of Syria when they assume the Germans will be successful in Russia and then they come through Syria. And so what they do is they actually develop a role for the cavalry to stay behind saboteurs in the Syrian mountains, using mortars a lot, getting resupplied by airdrop. So, again, you've got this kind of different generations of technology, horse and aircraft operating together. But that's at the end of this whole process. If you go back to the start of the process, we'll take 1920 as the year dot there. Yes, they realise that in a major European war, ultimately armoured cars are going to be developed better over the next few years, and therefore they won't need horses. But the British Army isn't really doing the actual developing of those armoured cars, at least not yet. The yeomanry regiments that during World War I were converted either to cyclist infantry or mounted infantry, they convert them back to cavalry. And they tell them, okay, we'll turn you back to cavalry for now, but obviously we're going to convert you to something else, probably armoured cars later on.
I'm fascinated by this idea of yeoman infantry. And it's helped by the fact I've been reading. I read earlier in the year memoirs of a fox hunting man, Sassoon's book set before the First World War. And I envision these yeomanry units of the 1930s to be not dissimilar, because they're territorials, aren't they?
Yeah, not dissimilar at all. Very, very. And really, the yeomanry units of the 1920s, 30s go back to being what the yeomanry units of the early 1900s, of the 1880s, 1890s were, really. So, yeah, as I say, we've got 1920, they know they're going to have to mechanise. Main problem is that in the 1920s, there's no appetite to spend lots of money on the armed forces, so they're not going to invest and re-roll them. 1930s, by the time the realisation for a need is there isn't the money. Even when we do start spending money on the armed forces, what they're spending it on is Spitfire, radar, fleet escorts, that kind of thing. They are not spending them on the TA's cavalry. Because by the 1930s, most of the regular cavalry regiments have been mechanised. Not all of them, but most of them. There's two reasons for that. One is that they need fast-moving troops who can scout ahead of a main column. And if they haven't got sufficient vehicles for that, those men have to be on horses. There's no two ways about it. Aircraft cannot do close reconnaissance. Even until the Kosovo War in 1999, that was still very painfully exposed. You can't rely on aircraft, even then, to get up that close and personal and be that effective in terms of spotting what's going on. And so it's definitely the case in the 1920s and 30s. So there's a capability gap that had to be bridged. And until they got the vehicles to do it, there had to be horses. That's point one. And the British were particularly bad at investing in development of armour, particularly bad at it. The Germans were good at it because they went all or nothing. They spent lots of money. They essentially set up a whole new mindset with essentially a kind of slush fund to do it. And the British weren't doing it. You had to sign and kind of pitch every penny you were going to spend. And if you don't know what you're going to spend, then you don't know what you're going to develop. So you have cavalry developing slowly. You have the need for cavalry to vet, and being the British Army, there's the Imperial Colonial Police Force side of life as well. Why bother to spend money on vehicles when the horses do the job just fine? And it's that just fine element that I suppose essentially kind of ossifies this role for now. When you get to 1939, there are 3 regular regiments still on horses, and you've got something like 9. Actually, I think it's slightly more than that. You've got around about 10 yeomanry regiments still on horses. The yeomanry know full well they're never going to go into combat as horsemen, ironically. That's taken as read. Nobody joins the yeomanry because they're expecting to go to war on horseback. People join the yeomanry because the TA is good fun. It's a weekend role. And so, again, if you think back to Sassoon's Memoirs of the Fox Hunting Man, that's essentially the life of the officers and the soldiers. The NCOs, incidentally, were typically successful local businessmen who wanted a weekend of charging around on horses, and they were actually far more dynamic and far richer than the officers, who were all kind of broken down squirearchy with no money left. And it was the NCOs who very much ran the units.
I can see it being incredibly class-based.
Incredibly so.
And then you'll probably get troopers, presumably, who are fantastic riders and horsemen, but not necessarily with any money because they're some sort of farm labourers.
Well, the officers didn't have much money either. And traditionally, if you go back to the late Victorian period, and actually really probably up to World War I, often farm labourers, as a clause in their tenancy, like to rent their house, had to serve in the yeomanry. That's not the case after World War I. But you still got that kind of lingering vestige of it almost, certainly in that kind of class-based approach. The officers crucially all know each other. They've grown up with each other. That's why they're the officers, and it's not these kind of successful local businessmen who are the NCOs who actually have a much better time, I suspect. There's a wonderful quote from John Verdon. He says, to be a yeomanry officer in the 1930s was not a great military strain, but it was a constitutional one, because there's a lot of alcohol that goes down range for all of them. But basically, you got guys who love riding around in the wild on horses and getting absolutely bluted every second weekend. They all like that, where it's officers, soldiers, or NCOs, and it's all very, very good fun. It's such a stupid idea to imagine that in a modern war, horses will go into battle. Nobody cares about it. And as a result, the tactics don't evolve either. And the other point here is that the British Army, as an article of policy, is not evolving tactics, because it places initiative on the shoulders of junior commanders, and therefore doesn't want to prescribe how they should act. You do have field service regulations, which gives us operational doctrine evolving, but that's very clearly charted. You can see that. You can see the different editions of FSR throughout the interwar period. At one point, Wavell is the man responsible for that. But it's deliberately leaving initiative open for junior commanders to use their initiative, because that's how the British do things. And interestingly, the Germans achieve what the British are trying to do precisely by giving a prescribed set of tactics, because they know that in battle, everything's so confusing. People go into their shell unless they've got something concrete that they can do. So the Germans give them a kind of repertoire of tactics from which they can choose, which is why it's effective for the German junior commanders and it's ineffective for the British junior commanders. And it's not really until Montgomery, 1942, the British Army solves all of this and has unit-level standard battle drills, which are the same from unit to unit.
So are they essentially going into the war equipped as they went into the First World War? I mean, there's uniforms, because the uniforms all get changed in the 30s to battle dress. Is everything just static?
There is one change, and that is in World War II, their boots got laces in the front. They even have the same light machine guns, the Hotchkiss gun. At one point we had Brenns in the 30s, but Brenns then get taken off them to equip the regulars, and they go back to having Hotchkiss guns, which aren't as reliable. And actually, you can go back to slightly before World War One, and the only change, I think it's from about 1907, give or take, the only change there is that, apart from the laces, is that the handle grip on the sabre is switched from leather to rubber. So that's another huge change for them. Things start to change in 1938, because in April 1938, Chamberlain, who in fairness has been preparing for war and has been getting his country ready to defend its own coastline, radar, Spitfire, etc., he suddenly realises that actually he ought to make an effort to have a continental force to fight alongside the French army. Because really, in terms of land fighting, it's the French army that's the cornerstone of British defence policy, not the British army. But in 1938, he realised he's going to have to spend some money. The easiest way to do that quickly and cheaply is to TA, because they only do 25 training years a year. So he does spend lots of money is suddenly released into the TA. And overnight, interest and enthusiasm beyond the traditional recruiting ground floods into the TA, and people are very aware of the TA. People also have now trade wars coming. And so people start joining the TA to get ready for war. And also because, people living in towns, for example, people who were kind of switched on, like the tradesmen, apprentices, people who've got their eyes open, no war's coming, that when this war comes, there's a very strong chance they're going to end up in the trenches in the infantry. They don't want to be in the trenches. They've heard about them from their fathers. So they look for other units, signals, artillery, engineers. And of course, these yeomanry units, they're not going to go to war on horseback, so they join them. And then there's lots who join in April 1939 as well, when it's a sort of year into that period. It means you have very high caliber recruits joining, but the high caliber in the sense of their initiative and drive, not in terms of their horsemanship skills. And typically, the recruits in 1939 are young townsmen, late teens, early 20s, who are anticipating war. They're foresighted and they're switched on, but they know absolutely nothing about horses, never been near a horse. And from April 1939 to September 1939, probably get around about 20-25 days of training for both soldiering and horsemanship, because they get a few weekends and their annual camp. And then that's them operationally deployable in September 1939.
Doesn't sound like a lot of time to learn to ride, to be honest, or ride well.
I mean, there's no pretending that this force was really much use for anything in September 1939. But it was there, and it was there plugging a gap on the Army's Horseback document. Army needs close reconnaissance of soldiers. Here's 9 regiments of cavalry. Should we have to use them? The British Army that deploys to Europe, the mainland, has no horses. It's the most modern army on the European continent, because unlike the French and the Germans, it's all mechanised. The Germans and the French, A, have a lot of horse-drawn transport, B, have a lot of operational cavalry units on horses.
So why did they send them to the Middle East?
Partly because there's nothing there they can muck up.
That wasn't the answer I was expecting.
In September 1939, Italy hasn't entered the war. France is declared war against the Germans. There's no war clouds in the Middle East. That's safe. So, crumbs, we've got these guys. And so they send them up there. The thing that really fascinates me, and I don't think is ever fully adequately answered, is why they were mobilised as cavalry in September 1939 and not just as infantry. Some bureaucrat somewhere issued the orders to compulsorily purchase 8,000 horses. The Yeomanry aren't issued with horses, remember, in peacetime. They rent horses on a weekend-by-weekend basis. Or, they go to annual camp, they go to a local merchant and rent a box of horses. In September 1939, civil servants are sent around the country with a checkbook saying, you've got a horse, here's £40, we'll have that. And no, you can't argue about it. Or it's a really good horse, here's 60 quid, we'll have it.
It's a tremendous amount of horses then to decide to ship to the Middle East, which presumably is a logistic pain in the backside, because I don't suppose Britain has deployed horses in that number for 20 plus years.
Precisely. Now, what do they do with those horses? There's, I think, 2 regular cavalry regiments out there, 2 to be replaced with 9. because they're regular cavalry regiments, the assumption is quite reasonably that these are the pro soldiers. So you move them back, you convert them to armour, they'll do it quicker and better. So they can be the grown-up soldiers fighting in France. Meanwhile, the yeomanry can wait for the Middle East. I think what it does do, in fairness, is it puts a sizable British force in the Middle East to deter local uprising, which is an issue. And the thing about horses is that they are, in terms of manpower, a force multiplier because they cover more ground. So actually, you've got 9 units that are more capable than infantry units because they can cover more ground. Point 2, the terrain actually is very, very well suited to horses. And in the north, where you're doing all your patrolling, horses are great for it. And in the south, it's a great area for armoured cars and tanks and things, so that when eventually the vehicles are available, they can be re-rolled and trained quickly. But that last point is still the same theme as 1920. When the vehicles become available, we'll re-roll you.
Does such a large amount of horses suddenly arriving in, is it Palestine they ship to? Does it become a problem? Because you start thinking about 8,000 horses is a tremendous amount of horses to feed. Where do you put them? That's a lot of field space you'd stick them in.
I mean, if you don't really stick them in the field, I mean, they keep moving them around precisely for that reason. You know, if you leave them in one area, they'll strip of all its resources. So they're spread all over Palestine, and they keep rotating around. And when actually they start training them properly for war, they're always on the move anyway. The horses sleep in open lines where basically you draw up, you take a squadron, for example, you draw up 2 sort of 100-yard long lengths of rope, one at breast height for horses, that's a breast rope, one at kind of ankle height for the horse, that's the kind of hoof ankle rope, as it were. That's the front of the line, as it were. You put another rope along the back, and you might hobble the horses, their back feet, or whatever it is that you do. Or you typically you have an ankle rope, like tying into the ankle rope, should I say. But point is, that can be put up and taken down in an eye blink. The horses get used to it pretty quickly, and they keep moving. They're on the march the whole time. And there are combat experienced horse soldiers out in the Middle East in the form of the Trans-Jordan Frontier Force. They've been fighting the Arab uprising in the late 30s. They had been taking on banditos and smugglers. So they know about using horses in that area. And Brigadier Crystal, for example, of the Trans-Jordan Frontier Force, completely overhauls the yeomanry who were put under his command. And his brigade in particular become real pros under his training. And they get really, really good. And at the same time, their machine gun troop are getting really, really good. And by early 1941, they are an effective fighting force. Really, really well-trained fighting force. They haven't been to action, but they are really, really, really well-trained.
Which sort of brings us to the action, because we have, it is a sort of backwater in that early period of 1940, but obviously Italy entered the war in summer of 1940. France falls in 1940. Britain suddenly got aboard with
Vichy France, yeah. Well, it's mandate, yeah.
Vichy France in the sort of that Levant area, and have got Italy coming in from Egypt. So perhaps for context, we should explain why Britain decides to pick a fight with the French, who they could otherwise ignore when they're presumably stretched for resources.
They are stretched for resources. More specifically, it's Churchill who picks a fight with the French because the British and Middle East don't want to launch this campaign. They don't have the resources for it. In particular, Wavell, who was CIC Middle East, doesn't want to do it because he's been put under pressure to launch Operation Battle Axe. He has just carried out his operation in Greece and lost loads of men. He had to fight in Crete, lost 11,000 men doing that. At the same time, pressure was being exerted on him to march into and stabilise Iraq. So that was 3 brigades, which he now no longer didn't have available to defend Palestine. He hasn't got any men left. And so when Churchill, who is in turn being pressurised by de Gaulle, Churchill and de Gaulle are saying, right, now we need to stop Vichy French from invading Palestine. We're always going, what do you mean? I haven't got anything to do it with. Now, by that point, he still actually has a sort of brigade and a half of horsemen left. I mean, most of the rest of the division has been re-rolled by this stage, but the 5th Cavalry Brigade still exists, and there's a few other odds and ends floating around. And this is despite Churchill's express orders. Churchill got wind of the fact the cavalry were being maintained in the Middle East and hit the roof and ordered them to dissolve them immediately, to re-roll them. I'm not sure if it was Wavell's decision or not, but someone somewhere had obviously taken a decision to hide them from Churchill. So they moved them around, they changed their name, but they deliberately kept them mounted. And at one point, actually, so a couple of regiments had motorised, but they put into lorries, one squadron in each of these regiments. And early 1941, those motorised truck-borne squadrons are rehorsed, much to the displeasure of the yeomanry themselves. Going, what are you doing? You just become really good at, truck mechanics and all that kind of stuff. They're now even putting us back on horses. It means that when yet another impossible task, as Wavell sees it, is asked of them, the only many people hastily switched Australians from 7th Division and anything else you can dredge up, which means 5th Cavalry Brigade.
What intrigued me is it Operation Exporter, the Syria, with Jumbo Wilson, Henry Matron Wilson in charge. What it intrigued me was that after 20-some years of not really thinking about horses, they're suddenly planning a campaign with horses. And does the planners, those staff officers, have any clue what to do with horses?
Not really. There is a planning conference in the first week of June, end of May possibly. Anyway, planning conference for the exporter force. They're looking at their resources, saying, okay, well, this unit here can do that, this unit here can do that. Hang on. Mountains, flank guard. And the minutes show that they discuss using a squadron of Mounted Cavalry from the Cheshire Yeomanry, because the Cheshire Yeomanry have been trained by Crystal and are therefore top-notch, like the rest of the 5th Cavalry Brigade. At the same time, they've switched the Staffordshire Yeomanry, or some of the Staffordshire Yeomanry, who are also trained by Crystal, into being motorised infantry to be a kind of divisional asset, like essentially a kind of strategic reserve, or kind of divisional reserve. By the end of that same conference, because they've been talking through the problem, they realised they don't need a squadron of cavalry, they need a regiment of cavalry. I don't think that's a product of understanding horses, that's a product of just being able to do the arithmetic. That said, you don't need to be an expert in warfare to know that horses are going to be able to cope mountainside better than infantry or vehicles. That conversation shows they don't really understand the horses. The conversations that all the Australian infantry brigadiers have with the yeomanry who first meet them also show that. The fact that it is only the Cheshire Yeomanry who are initially rolled as his flank guard and spear point in many ways, but as you go through the rest of the campaign and they see what the cavalry are capable of, that changes completely. So by the end of Operation Exporter, 5-6 weeks later, first of all, it's not a regiment being used anymore. It's a brigade. There's 3 regiments all doing the same role. And they have taken a bunch of Australian Bren carrier crews and mounted them because they need horsemen more than they need Bren carriers. And if you look at the war diaries, like brigade and divisional war diaries note, the average infantry battalion gets mentioned once a day. The yeomanry units, and by which I mean troops and squadrons, 30 men, 100 men, are getting mentioned 3 or 4 times a day.
How have they been used? Are they sort of being used as, rather than recon, are they doing sort of bite and hold sort of operations? Or
no, that's very much a fighting one, and they are being used for reconnaissance. They're doing close reconnaissance. They are doing flank guard. Why are they so useful in Lebanon, which is what they mean when we talk about Syria in these days, is because of the mountains. So there were only really 3 routes that Operation Exporter could follow, because there's bottlenecks created by mountains. These essentially valley routes. So you send your brigade, your infantry brigade column up each one, and if you want to stop them from getting ambushed, you need to have troops on the hillsides either side. I'm talking very, very broad terms here, and that's cavalry. When, lo and behold, the coastal thrust fails to cross the Litani River, they realise very quickly they need to recognised with the rest of the Litani River, which kind of goes across Lebanon at that particular point. It goes east to west towards the sea, and they need to find crossings PDQ. The only forces they have who can do that are cavalry. So it's the cavalry who do that.
Jonathan, we're going to pause it there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. What did intrigue me is the Cheshires, isn't it? The Cheshire Yeomanry, as they're spread out and they have a 5-mile frontage. What intrigued me was if they were tanks that have radios to radio between one another, how does a unit spread out over 5 miles communicate within itself? Are they swamped with radios, which are big things at this period? They're not kind of small handheld portables.
Yeah, good question. Well, the problem here is not the availability of radios. There's plenty of radio sets, but it's the effectiveness of those radio sets because of the mountains. And the mountains cut off the signal from radio. So even if you had lots of tanks, they wouldn't be able to communicate. So a lot of the time they communicate by runner, i.e. galloper and horseback. That's the whole basis of the story of Spencer's Ride, which we'll come to in due course, which is essentially the issue of how to get a galloper back to regimental HQ to inform brigade in turn. You see it when individual troops are coming into villages. So flank guard, for example, what it really means is you're operating quite separate, quite well away from the main column, very much under your own steam, on your own kind of march timetable, clearing ground, and there's villages around. And the way typically a cavalry troop sorts out each village, what they do is they post their machine gun section on high ground to cover it. One troop goes straight round to the back, looping round to cut any telephone wires, and then the rifle sections go into the other rifle sections. Go into the village itself, clear it, and at that point, the troop leader will send a galloper back to Squadron HQ, SHQ, and then in turn to RHQ, who then will but at some point along the way, a radio message will be sent as soon as it's possible to send a radio message. And those gallopers and their interaction with the troop leaders make some fairly conspicuous targets. There's an occasion when the French machine gun team wait until the troop leader is handing over his reports to the galloper, and at that point, the machine gun team who've been lying hidden, that's when they open fire. And the bullets fall between the galloper and the troop leader.
Almost sounds Napoleonic with the gallopers, doesn't it? It's something from Victorian times, your gallopers moving around information.
Well, another thing that's Napoleonic is that each man carries a sabre. They have trumpeters because also they need to be able to communicate across the squadron sometimes. So that you still have your trumpeters doing their bugling. Like Napoleonic cavalry, there's reconnaissance being done. Unlike Napoleonic cavalry, you don't need them charging enemy squares. Take the evolution of that. A Napoleonic infantry battalion in a square is essentially infantry in a prepared position. You wouldn't charge a square, really, actually. What you would do is you would break it with artillery and then send in cavalry.
Or you would pin it in place with your cavalry milling around rather than directly attacking. You become the threat while something else comes up to deal with it.
Yeah, so it's in tandem with something else, and you wouldn't have them by himself take on prepared position. That's the same in World War I, World War II. So actually, conceptually, what's changed? What you really need them for is reconnaissance and scouting ahead. That's exactly the same. Why do they carry sabres? Because each man is armed with an automatic rifle, and as your point section is following a path around around a mountainside, your point man has sabre drawn, because if there's an enemy in front of him who suddenly appears from behind a bush or something, he needs to be able to react in that eye blink rather than solemnly clock his rifle. That's a couple of seconds. He has to be able to react. If the man behind him has his rifle at the ready, but he's got the luxury of 3 or 4 seconds to cock his rifle and fire. Curiously,
the opposing French had cavalry units as well, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yeah, and actually, most of the opposition to the yeomanry are French cavalry because they have machine gun teams, and those machine gun teams set up and cover a bridge or a village or whatever it is. The British yeomanry appear. There's a bit of a scrap, and then the French get out there as quick as they possibly can. infantry couldn't do that.
Exactly. Cavalry. So it's cavalry being used in those fast moving, which is absolutely fascinating. Cavalry on cavalry. There's no cavalry charges. That would be just too much to ask, wouldn't it?
Well, the very nearly is. The very, very nearly is. So just before midnight, for the ceasefire, one of the troop leaders at night time has reconnoitred a French artillery battery. And because they're very, very good at reconnaissance, but they get right up close to them and they can see, one, where this battery is, two, that they're unprotected because the yeomanry have penetrated past the first line of French forces, and three, that this is excellent cavalry ground. The horses can get up really close unnoticed, and it's nighttime. So that troop leader goes back to SHQ, and in the dark, the whole squadron is preparing to attack them. They're checking their girths, they're checking sabres, all the rest of it. They are just mounting up when a messenger arrives to say, stand down, ceasefire. But their plan was to charge them in the dark.
That would have been quite remarkable.
What a typical cavalry action looks like in this, if you take that example with the troop leader and galloper, is you're out on the flank, you're acting on the local initiative, your troop comes to a village, section goes around the back, cuts it off, machine gun section covers the whole thing, you clear the village, and then you push on your way. The most dramatic probably this is the episode of Spencer's Ride. This is where the Exporter Force desperately need to find bridges across Litani. We need to find intact bridges over the Litani. And at this stage, a squadron is on point, and Lieutenant Rogers' two troopers on point. And there's a photo, in fact, taken from the saddle from a guy at the back of the troop, of two troop approaching the Litani. Little does he know that not long after that photograph's taken, they're going to be in action. And that's in the book. That's on the back cover of it. They approach the Litani. At this point, there's a 1,000-foot drop off either side of it, and the water is too fast flowing. The current's too powerful to reliably and safely swim it as a troop. And so Lieutenant Rogers posts his machine gun section to cover the bridge, and he sends down two scouts to cross it. And then once they're across, he then rides out across the bridge himself. Just as his horse sets hoof on the bridge, French Spahi cavalry machine gun team open fire, and Rogers gallops his horse across the bridge to the north side. The reason he's galloping towards the enemy there is because the enemy are on a hillside, so if he can gallop quickly to get under them, they can't shoot down and he's safe. And that's where his two men are. One of those point men gallops back, passing Rogers on the bridge, because he needs to get back to his section, leaving Rogers, the troop leader, pinned down and isolated on the northern side with a trooper. The firefighters now started, the whole troop taking on the machine gun team. Corporal Spencer gallops across the bridge by himself, on bullets flying all around him, because he has to get, he's the machine gun troop leader. He has to be next to the troop leader to find out what the hell's going on and to find out what the orders are. Which incidentally would also mean he'd have to gallop back across it. But, they're all pinned down, they're losing horses, they're taking fire, they're shooting back, but the bridge is intact. And Rogers, he's got Corporal Spencer and Trooper Mellors next to him. And he says, right, Mellor, here's my written instruction, as it were. Go back and tell RHQ we have found the bridge. Get there now. Mellor works his way along the dead ground on the northern bank of the Litani, where he reckons he's out of range for machine guns. Then he exposes himself to view by jumping his horse into the Litani and swimming across it. Dangerous, but that's the only option available. His brief is to get back to RHQ and tell them we found the bridge. And he's got a map of them and everything. At this point, Rogers has second thoughts and he thinks, I've just sent a teenage trooper in country that I needed a guide to get through. He's not going to be able to get his way back to RHQ. It's too confusing and mountainous and twisty. So he says, right, Corporal Spencer, you're the grown-up here. Here's my other map, my last map. You go and do it as well. Two gallopers that should be able to, and Spencer does exactly the same thing. So Spencer works his way along the dead ground of the northern bank to reckon he's out of range, jumps his horse, he's called Little Nell, into the Litani, and they start swimming. The current is so powerful that rider and horse are separated almost instantly. And it's so powerful that it also rips off the saddle. So everything's gone off little now. Saddle, sword, rifle. Spencer is lost the map. It's all gone. All he's got now is word of mouth. When he heaves himself exhausted onto the southern bank, still in machine gun range, his horses there waiting for him, just standing still, believing it's machine gun fire.
What are you doing? Hurry up.
Yeah, exactly. And he hauls himself onto little now and gallops back. About an hour later, he's at RHQ, saying we found the bridge. And meanwhile, the firefights going on. The regimental machine gun troop who've got Vickers guns, they come belting up the road, ready to mete out vengeance on the Spahi machine gun team. But at that point, machine gun Spahi team see another troop, like half a mile over to their right, realise they're getting outflanked, and they pull back.
I'm intrigued by, at the end of the campaign, when the British Army reflected upon the actions of the cavalry, how well did the British Army feel that they'd performed?
Superbly. The Cheshire Yeomanry, for example, was being singled out by the senior commanders of the operation. That's because Cheshire Yeomanry had been busier than other units. I refer back to this point where at the beginning, the plan was we ought to have one squadron attached. Then it's, okay, we'll have a full regiment. Within a week or two, they've got a whole brigade deployed. The role was so essential because of the terrain. And the yeomanry units are no longer being placed under brigade command, but under divisional command. And they're the units that get mentioned more than anything else in war diaries. And it's not just the units, it's individual troops being mentioned and given particular tasks to carry out on behalf of the division. To carry out reconnaissance of this, scout that bridge, that kind of stuff. And they're very good at it, partly because they've been well trained by Crystal, but fundamentally the physics of it are that horses can cover ground faster than a man can, and they can cover ground that vehicles can't. And you can quickly and easily get machine guns up onto a ridge to cover a French-held road that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. They're much quieter than vehicles. They can do close reconnaissance. They are penetrating deep behind French lines. They are reconnoitering French artillery batteries that are so well hidden that you need to be standing right next to the hut the French gun is hidden in to see that it's being pulled back with its muzzle away from window. Aircraft can't do that. It's out of range of infantry. And they are finding their way in past French sentries, then finding their way back out again, undetected. Horses are quiet. And they don't need to be resupplied. They don't need fuel because there's enough grass for horses just to live off. And there's enough mountain streams. So for rations, it's only for humans, and then they just buy it off the locals.
In which case, having performed so well and seen to have performed so well, what happens to the brigade after Syria?
They're flavour of the month, and they get re-rolled to be mountain warfare specialists. So they get, for example, an extra machine gun troop per regiment. They get larded with mortars so that they can basically have more bite. Because one thing they couldn't really do, one shortcoming was they weren't equipped to fight as such, to be a strike force. They were organised and dispersed for reconnaissance and flank guard. And actually, they would have been a bit more handy if it had a few more machine gun sections and some mortar sections. So that's an obvious improvement to their capability. This role is refined for them because in 1941, so the Germans are doing well in Soviet Russia, and they're expecting the Germans to defeat the Russians, and therefore by the end of the year to be a threat to the Middle East because they can come down through Syria. And so they will garrison Syria, the British, they will fight in Syria, and when they pull back under the weight of the German onslaught, they will post 5th Cavalry Brigade in the Syrian mountains operating behind German lines, being resupplied by airdrop to harass the enemy rear with their mortars and machine guns and their horses. And that is as sure an evolution of both their role and the appreciation of their role as anything else. Why does that not happen? Because the Germans fail on their strategic objectives in Russia. And
the units just become mechanised, and that's it for the horses?
Pretty much by the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, actually, February 1942, there's a desperate need for signallers across the Middle East. Syria is safe, so they don't really need mounted specialists, but you do need signallers. So most of those units essentially are either mechanised or they turn into signallers. And as you say, that's it for horses. It's a very, very traumatic, emotionally, process for the cavalrymen. Remember what I said at the beginning about the horses were compulsory purchased from the civilian population. A lot of them have been handed over quite willingly particularly by the hunting fraternity, and that these were very valued animals. That riders were very close to them. So when these hunting families give the horses to the army, they attach little notes to the bridles. There's one saying, "Rufus, 7 years old, can be handled in and out of the stable by a child. Please be kind to him." And in March 1942, when these units are being sent to the rather euphemistically named remand depots, in other words, to either be retrained or to be shot, the soldiers also leave little messages attached to the bridles saying, this horse has grown up as a family hunter, has been my friend during war, he's used to being kindly treated, please make it quick, all that kind of stuff. And the soldiers weeping against their horses' heads as they water and feed them for the last time. And Verdun, British Yeomanry, writes in his regimental history, there are some scenes in life so full of emotion they defy adequate description. A cavalry regiment saying goodbye to its horses is one of those.
Yeah, and I guess it's been with most of them at least 18 months with these animals. And I get how many, I'm not sure even how many would be necessarily repurposed in the British Army at this point, or is literally 8,000 horses shot. And I don't suppose I want to sell them to the local populace in case they're used nefariously against the British.
Quite a few of them are repurposed because they're repurposed to pull general service wagons in Italy and Sicily.
I thought you were going to say for polo.
Yeah, they get repurposed to pull these GS wagons in Italy and Sicily. Some get given to local police units. There's a lot of horses that won't lower themselves to pull a wagon. Those horses and the horses that just aren't needed are shot by the staff at the remand depots. But the only plus of that is that remand depots are very skilled at handling horses, and so it is as humane and quick as possible. It's not like what the Germans were doing with their cavalry division in Russia, where they lined them up at the edge of the cliff and machine gunned them off it. So a lot of horses end up in Italy and Sicily, and at the end of the war get sold to farmers, but none of them get shipped back to the UK.
Yeah, it's a sad end. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about British cavalry units in the Second World War, the book is Fighting Vichy from Horseback, British Mounted Cavalry in Action, Syria, 1941. Don't forget, if you have enjoyed the podcast, you can sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast for advert-free listening and extras when I have them. So that is it for this episode. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.